To understand what happened that night, you need to understand the racial landscape of America in 1962. You need to understand what it meant to be a black man trying to navigate a world that wasn't ready for him. You need to understand Las Vegas, at a time when the city was built on segregation and prejudice and casual cruelty that was so accepted it didn't even seem like cruelty anymore. It was just the way things were. It was just business as usual. By 1962, Sammy Davis Jr. had already achieved something extraordinary. He was one of the greatest entertainers in the world. He could sing, he could dance, he could make you laugh and make you cry with equal skill. He had performed in front of millions of people. He had made records that topped the charts. He had appeared in movies alongside the biggest stars in Hollywood. He was a talent of such magnitude that it was impossible to ignore. Sammy had come a long way from his early days. He was born in 1925 to vaudeville performers, Elvira Sanchez and Sam Davis Sr. His childhood was spent traveling from place to place, performing in clubs and theaters across America. His father had taught him to sing and dance before he could even read. By the time Sammy was 5 years old, he was already a performer. By the time he was a teenager, he was one of the most talented young performers in America. But there was one thing that Sammy Davis Jr. could not overcome in 1962. He was black. And in 1962 America, being black meant that no matter how talented you were, no matter how famous you were, no matter how much money you had, there were places you couldn't go and things you couldn't do. There were restaurants that wouldn't serve you. There were hotels that wouldn't let you stay. There were bathrooms you couldn't use. There were schools you couldn't attend. There were entire sections of society that were closed to you simply because of the color of your skin. Las Vegas was one of those places. The city had been built on segregation. It had been built by men who understood that they could make enormous amounts of money by catering to white audiences while keeping black people in a subordinate position. The casinos and hotels that lined the Strip were segregated establishments. They were built with segregation as a foundational principle. Every wall, every policy, every rule was designed to maintain the racial hierarchy that made the wealthy owners wealthy. Black entertainers could perform on stage for white audiences, but they couldn't stay in the hotels. They couldn't eat in the restaurants. They couldn't gamble in the casinos. They couldn't swim in the pools. They couldn't drink from the water fountains marked for white people only. They could entertain white people, but they couldn't be treated as equals by those same white people. In fact, they had to accept being treated as servants. They had to accept being treated as less than human. This was the contradiction at the heart of segregation in Las Vegas. The city needed black entertainers. The casinos needed talented performers to draw crowds. They needed the Franks and the Deans and the Sammys to make their establishments prestigious and exciting. But they also needed to keep those same entertainers in their place. They needed to make sure that no matter how famous or talented a black performer became, they would always be reminded that they were not welcome to be treated as equals. The Sands Hotel was one of the most prestigious establishments in Las Vegas. It was owned by people with connections to organized crime. It was a place where money changed hands in amounts that most people could never imagine. It was where deals were made. It was where power brokers gathered. It was where Frank Sinatra performed regularly, bringing with him an aura of sophistication and cool that made the Sands the coolest place in Las Vegas. It was also where Dean Martin had become a legend. Dean had performed at the Sands hundreds of times. He knew the staff, he knew the management, he knew the owners. He had a standing reservation for a suite. He could walk into the Sands like he owned the place, because, in many ways, the Sands knew that Dean Martin was essential to its success. Dean could pack the Copa room night after night. Dean brought in the crowds. Dean made them money. But the Sands was also a segregated establishment. The policies of segregation were written into the very structure of the hotel. Black performers could appear on stage, but they had to enter through separate entrances. Entrances that were hidden away from the main lobby, away from the eyes of white guests. They had to stay in separate hotels nearby. Sometimes they had to stay in hotels that were miles away from the Sands, then drive over for performances. They had to accept the humiliation and dehumanization that came with segregation as the price of performing in Las Vegas. It was an arrangement that everyone understood. It was an arrangement that had been in place for years. It was an arrangement that nobody questioned. The owners didn't question it because it made them money and it maintained the racial hierarchy they believed in. The white performers didn't question it because it benefited them and because most of them didn't see it as wrong. The black performers didn't question it because questioning it meant losing opportunities, losing income, losing access to platforms that could advance their careers. Sammy Davis Jr. had been accepting that arrangement for years. He had performed at the Sands multiple times. He had performed at other casinos and hotels along the Strip. He had smiled through the indignity of separate entrances and separate accommodations. He had endured the casual racism that permeated every interaction. He had heard jokes about his color. He had watched other performers get treated with respect while he was treated as a problem to be managed. He had endured all of it because he was a professional, because he needed the work, because refusing to accept segregation meant refusing opportunities that could advance his career. But Sammy was also a thinking man. He was an intelligent, articulate person who understood the immorality of what he was experiencing. He was a man who had served his country in the military. He was a man who had helped entertain American troops during World War II. He was a man who had sacrificed for his country, and yet his country was telling him that he wasn't good enough to use the same door as white people. In 1962, something was changing in America. The civil rights movement was gaining momentum. People were beginning to question the system of segregation. Activists were demanding change. The conscience of America was being awakened to the moral bankruptcy of treating people differently based on the color of their skin. And people were beginning to understand that segregation wasn't just a social problem, it was a moral emergency. Dean Martin had grown up around people of different backgrounds. Steubenville, Ohio, the town where he was born, had a diverse population. He had worked with black performers throughout his career. He had seen talented people treated as less than human simply because of their race. He had watched it happen over and over again, and each time it had bothered him more than the last time. Dean was also becoming increasingly aware of his own power and influence. He was one of the most popular entertainers in America. He had access to platforms and resources that most people could never dream of having. He had the ear of powerful people. He had the respect of audiences. And he was beginning to understand that with that power and influence came a responsibility to use it for something more than just making money and entertaining people. On the evening of May 18, 1962, Dean Martin arrived at the Sands Hotel for a performance. It was a Friday night. The weather in Las Vegas was hot and dry, the way it always was in May. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the desert landscape that surrounded the city. Dean pulled up to the front entrance of the Sands in his car. A valet immediately came to take the vehicle. Dean got out and stretched. He was wearing an expensive suit. Perfectly tailored, perfectly pressed, he looked every inch the star that he was. He looked like a man who belonged exactly where he was. He was a major draw. He packed the Copa Room night after night. The Copa Room at the Sands was one of the premier entertainment venues in Las Vegas. It could hold several hundred people. When Dean Martin was performing, it was sold out weeks in advance. People paid good money to see him. They came from all over the world to watch him sing and tell jokes and charm his way through an evening of entertainment. The hotel management loved him because he made them money, a lot of money. But Dean was also increasingly uncomfortable with the segregation policies of the establishment. He had been noticing things, he had been paying attention. He had been seeing things that other people seemed not to see. That evening, Sammy Davis Jr. was scheduled to perform as well. Sammy was in town for the week, and he had a standing arrangement to perform at the Sands. Despite the indignity of the segregation policies, Sammy's late-night show had become a popular attraction. People would come early to see Dean, and then they would stay for Sammy's show as well. The two performers had become friends, and their respective audiences had come to appreciate both of them. Sammy was supposed to arrive at the hotel at around 7:30 p.m., but there was a problem. Sammy had decided something. He had decided that he was tired of going through the rear entrance. He had decided that he was going to challenge the policy. He had decided that on this night, he was going to walk through the front door like any other guest. It was a decision that could have consequences. Going against the policies of the Sands Hotel could mean getting banned. It could mean not being booked for future performances. It could mean making enemies of powerful people who didn't like being challenged. But Sammy was tired of accepting the unacceptable. He was tired of pretending that segregation was okay. He was tired of walking through rear entrances. So, when Sammy arrived at the Sands Hotel that evening, he drove up to the front entrance. He got out of his car, he straightened his jacket, and he walked toward the front doors of the hotel. It didn't take long for the security staff to notice him. They had been trained to watch 4 black people trying to enter through the front entrance. It was part of their job. Their job was to maintain the segregation policies of the hotel. Their job was to make sure that the racial hierarchy was maintained. One of the security guards, a large man named Tom, stepped forward to intercept Sammy before he could reach the doors. "Where are you headed?" Tom asked, his tone suggesting that he already knew the answer wasn't going to be what he wanted to hear. "I'm going inside," Sammy said simply. "I'm performing here tonight. I'm going to check in and get ready for my show." "You need to go around back," Tom said, pointing away from the main entrance. "There's a rear entrance for entertainment staff. You'll need to use that." Sammy stood his ground. "Why should I have to use a rear entrance? I'm a guest here. I'm performing here. I'm paying money to stay here, just like anyone else. I should be able to use the main entrance." Tom's jaw tightened. He clearly hadn't expected to have to deal with any backtalk. Most performers just accepted the policies and went where they were told to go. "That's just how it works," Tom said. His voice had taken on an edge now. He was starting to get uncomfortable. Discomfort led to defensiveness. Defensiveness led to stubbornness. "Why?" Sammy asked. "Explain to me why I should have to use a different entrance than a white guest. Explain to me the logic of that policy." "There's no logic," Tom said, and there was almost a note of honesty in his voice. "It's just policy. It's just how things are done here. Now, are you going to go around back, or are we going to have a problem?" This was the moment. This was the choice point. Sammy could comply. He could go around back. He could accept the segregation and move on with his life, or he could stand his ground. He could refuse to accept the policy. He could make a stand, knowing that it might cost him something. Sammy stood his ground. "I'm not going around back," he said. "I'm going through the front door." Tom looked at his fellow security guards. He gestured slightly, indicating that they should form a barrier in front of the doors. Sammy was now surrounded by 3 large men in security uniforms, all of them trained to enforce the policies of the hotel. "Look," Tom said, "I don't want any trouble, but you need to understand that this is not going to work. There are policies, there are rules, and I have a job to do." "Your job," Sammy said, "is to enforce a segregation policy. That's what your job is. Let's be clear about that. You're not maintaining security. You're not protecting the hotel. You're enforcing racial segregation, and I'm not going to accept that anymore." By this point, other hotel staff had begun to notice what was happening. People were looking out from behind the desk. Managers were coming out from their offices. This was becoming a scene, and scenes were the last thing hotel management wanted. Dean Martin arrived at the Sands at around 6 p.m. for his 9 p.m. show. He went through the main entrance, as he always did. The hotel staff greeted him respectfully. The management came to shake his hand. The valet took care of his car. Everything was as it always was. He was a VIP. He was treated like one. He went directly to his dressing room. The room was spacious and well appointed. There was a large mirror with bright lights surrounding it. There were comfortable chairs and a full bar. There was a television and a telephone and everything else Dean might need to prepare for his performance. Dean sat down in front of the mirror and began reviewing the script for his show. The writers had put together some good material. There were some strong jokes. There were some good song selections. It was going to be a solid show. Dean had done this hundreds of times. He knew how to prepare. He knew how to get his mind in the right place to go out and perform. At around 7:30 p.m., as Dean was reviewing his material, there was a knock at his door. One of the hotel's security men came into the dressing room. The man looked uncomfortable. He was shifting his weight from one foot to the other. He was clearly about to deliver news that he didn't want to deliver. "Mr. Martin," the security man said, "we have a situation out front. One of your associates has arrived, but there's been some confusion about his accommodations." Dean set down the script he was reading and turned to face the man directly. He already had a sense of what was coming. "What do you mean, confusion?" Dean asked. His tone of voice suggested that he already knew exactly what the man was going to say, and he wasn't happy about it. "Well, sir," the security man said carefully, "Sammy Davis Jr. has arrived for his performance tonight. He was attempting to enter through the front entrance. Our security stopped him and redirected him to the rear entrance, as is policy. But he's refusing to go around back. He's saying he has a right to use the front entrance like everyone else. He's been waiting outside for about 15 minutes, and the situation is becoming somewhat tense." Dean's face went cold. He stood up from the chair where he had been sitting. "He's waiting outside?" Dean asked. There was something dangerous in his voice now. Not dangerous in a violent way, but dangerous in the way that a man sounds when he's made a decision and he's not going to be moved from it. Yes, sir? At the front entrance. Our security is trying to handle it discreetly, but who's handling it? Dean interrupted. Tom, sir? He's our head of security for the evening. Take me to him, Dean said. Mr. Martin, that's not necessary. We can resolve this with Mr. Davis. He'll understand. It's just policy. Everyone understands, Dean cut him off with a look. Take me to him now. The security man led Dean down the hallways of the Sands Hotel toward the front entrance. They moved quickly, but not so quickly as to draw too much attention. Dean could see other guests looking at them with curiosity as they passed. Something unusual was happening. The management didn't like unusual things. Unusual things caused problems. Unusual things brought attention to policies that preferred to remain unexamined and unquestioned. When they reached the front entrance, Dean saw Sammy Davis Jr. standing on the sidewalk in front of the hotel. Sammy was dressed impeccably in a suit and tie, a dress shirt with cufflinks, polished shoes. He was a striking man, handsome and dignified. He had the bearing of someone who understood his own worth, but his dignity was being tested. He was surrounded by 3 security guards who were trying to convince him to leave the front area and go around to the rear entrance. The guards were using different tactics. One was trying to appeal to reason. One was trying to appeal to tradition. One was trying to appeal to practicality. But Sammy was having none of it. He was standing firm. He was refusing to budge. When Sammy saw Dean coming toward him, his face changed. Relief washed over him. He knew Dean. They had become friends in recent years. They had performed together. They had spent time together socially. They had laughed together and sung together and worked together. And more than that, Dean had always treated him with respect and friendship, which was becoming increasingly rare in 1962. Dean, Sammy said, relief evident in his voice. Thank God. These gentlemen are telling me I can't use the front entrance. They're saying I need to go around back, but I don't understand why. I don't understand the logic of it. Dean looked at the 3 security guards. His expression didn't change, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes. It was the look of a man who was about to do something that he knew was right, regardless of the consequences. What's your name? Dean asked the guard closest to him, the one who appeared to be in charge. This was Tom, the head of security for the evening. Tom, sir, the guard said. His posture stiffened slightly. He seemed to sense that something important was about to happen. Tom, Dean said, and his voice was calm but carried an edge to it. What is this man doing on the sidewalk? Well, sir, Tom began, and he started to explain the situation. He talked about hotel policy. He talked about how black entertainers were required to use the rear entrance. He talked about organizational purposes. He talked about maintaining standards and keeping order. He talked about how it had always been done this way and how it had always worked fine. As Tom spoke, Dean listened. He let the man say everything he wanted to say. He let the security guard explain the reasoning behind segregation. He listened to the words that men had been using for decades to justify the unjustifiable. When Tom finished, Dean spoke. I don't want to hear about policy, Dean said. His voice was quiet, but it carried more weight than if he had been shouting. I don't want to hear about how things have always been done. I don't want to hear about organizational purposes or maintaining standards. I want to know one thing, and I want you to think carefully before you answer it. He pointed at Sammy. Do you see this man? This is Sammy Davis Jr. He is one of the greatest entertainers in the world. He is booked to perform here tonight. He is here to do a job. He is here to sing and dance and entertain people. Now, tell me something. What about the color of his skin makes him unworthy of using the same door that I just used to walk into this hotel? What about the color of his skin makes him less than me? Tom's face flushed. He seemed to struggle for words. It's not about being less than you, sir, Tom finally said. It's just policy. It's not personal. It's absolutely personal, Dean said. It's the most personal thing there is. You're telling a human being that he's not worthy of being treated with dignity? That's as personal as it gets. And you're basing that judgment solely on the color of his skin. If that's not personal, I don't know what is. Tom looked at his fellow security guards, as if seeking support, but they said nothing. They just stood there, uncertain how to proceed. Nobody had trained them for this. Nobody had prepared them for a situation where someone with Dean Martin's status and power would challenge the segregation policy of the hotel. Mr. Martin, Tom said carefully, I understand your feelings. I really do. But I have my orders from management. The policy is clear. We can't make exceptions, or it will cause problems with the other guests. Some guests might object to seeing a black man using the main entrance. Some guests might see it as violating the standards of the hotel. Other guests, Dean said, and there was something almost like pity in his voice. What other guests? What other guests are going to have a problem with Sammy Davis Jr. using the same entrance as them? Tell me their names. Tell me who will be offended. Because, I'll tell you something, Tom, if anyone has a problem with it, I will talk to them myself, personally. I will explain to them exactly what I think of their racism, and I will make sure they understand that it's not acceptable. By now, other hotel staff had begun to gather. Managers were looking out from behind the desk. Other guests were starting to pay attention. A scene was developing. Scenes were the last thing hotel management wanted. Mr. Martin, Tom said, please understand. It's not that I personally believe in this policy. It's not that I think it's right. It's just that I have a job to do. I have my orders from management, and I'm telling you, Dean said, that your orders are morally wrong. I'm telling you that your orders are unjust. And I'm telling you that I am not going to participate in them anymore. He turned to Sammy and extended his arm. Come on, Sammy, let's go inside. Dean, Sammy said softly, you don't have to do this. I can go around back. I've done it before. I can do it again. No, Dean said. No, you can't. Not tonight. Not with me here. Tonight, you're going to walk through that front door, and you're going to be treated like a guest instead of like a problem. Sammy took Dean's arm. Together, they turned toward the front entrance of the Sands Hotel. Tom and the other security guards made no move to stop them. They stood frozen, uncertain what to do. No one had ever challenged the policy like this before. No one had ever made it such a public issue. The guards had not been trained for this scenario. The policies of segregation had been in place for so long that nobody had ever dared to openly defy them. Dean and Sammy walked toward the revolving doors of the Sands Hotel. Every eye in the immediate area was on them. Guests who were arriving or leaving the hotel stopped and stared. Security personnel stood motionless. The valet attendants watched in stunned silence. This was a breach of the natural order. This was a violation of the unwritten rules that held segregation in place. This was a black man and a white man, together, refusing to accept segregation. They pushed through the revolving doors. They stepped into the lobby of the Sands Hotel. The lobby was one of the most luxurious spaces in Las Vegas. It was designed to impress. There were high ceilings and expensive carpets. There were crystal chandeliers and marble columns. There were uniformed staff members stationed at every entrance and exit. The lobby was a space designed to convey wealth and power and exclusivity. And now, Dean Martin and Sammy Davis Jr. were walking across that lobby together. The reaction was immediate. Every conversation stopped. Every person in the lobby seemed to freeze. This was unprecedented. This was something that nobody had seen before. This was a moment that would be remembered and talked about for decades to come. Dean didn't rush. He didn't hurry. He didn't act like he was doing anything unusual. He acted like two men of different races walking together through a hotel lobby was no big deal, which it shouldn't have been. But in 1962, in segregated Las Vegas, it absolutely was a big deal. They walked across the lobby toward the front desk. The desk staff watched them approach with a mixture of shock and confusion written all over their faces. This was not a situation they had been trained to handle. When they reached the front desk, Dean spoke to the hotel manager, a man named Gerald, who had worked at the Sands for many years. Gerald was a competent man, a career hotel employee who understood the business of running a luxury establishment. But he was also a man who believed in segregation. He believed in the policies. He believed in the natural order of things. Gerald, Dean said, his voice calm and friendly, as if nothing unusual was happening. Mr. Davis will be needing a room for the duration of his stay. I want him to have a good room. Give him the same treatment you'd give to any other guest. Give him one of the suites if possible. And I want to make sure that there's no confusion about this. He's a guest here. He's been paid to perform here. And he deserves to be treated with the same respect and hospitality that any guest would receive. Is that clear? Gerald's face went pale. He looked like he wanted to say no. He looked like he wanted to invoke policy and procedure and all the other excuses that had been used for years to justify segregation. But he was looking at Dean Martin, one of the hotel's biggest draws, a man who had just publicly challenged the segregation policy. He was looking at a man who had the power to cause serious problems for the hotel if he chose to do so. He was looking at a man who was not going to accept no as an answer. Gerald looked at Dean, then at Sammy, then back at Dean again. He seemed to be weighing his options. He seemed to be trying to figure out what to do. Finally, he nodded. "Of course, Mr. Martin," Gerald said quietly. "We'll take care of Mr. Davis. He'll have a nice room. We'll make sure he's well taken care of." Dean turned to Sammy and smiled. "There, that's better. Now you're going to be treated like a guest instead of like a problem. Welcome to the Sands. Enjoy your stay." The news spread like wildfire. Throughout the hotel, throughout the employee areas, throughout Las Vegas. The word spread that Dean Martin had challenged the segregation policy at the Sands. He had publicly confronted security. He had walked through the front entrance with a black man. He had demanded that Sammy Davis Jr. be given a room like any other guest. He had used his power and influence to force the hotel to change their policies, at least for this one night. Over the next few hours, the situation created waves of tension throughout the hotel. Some of the older managers wanted to punish Dean. Some of them suggested to each other that they could ban him from performing. But nobody wanted to be the one to suggest it officially. That would have caused an even bigger scandal. That would have meant losing one of the hotel's biggest draws. That would have been worse for business than simply allowing Sammy to use the front entrance and sleep in a regular room. So management made a decision. They would let it go. They would allow Sammy to stay in his room without harassment. They would not make an issue of it. But they also would not change their official policies. This was a one-time exception for Dean Martin. Everyone understood that, or so they thought. By the time Dean was scheduled to perform at 9 p.m., the situation had reached a kind of tense equilibrium. Sammy had been given a room. It was a good room. He would be performing later that evening at his scheduled time. He would be treated like a guest. And Dean was about to take the stage in front of a packed Copa room. Dean walked out onto that stage with a different energy than usual. He was still cool and collected, still the master of his craft. He still had perfect timing and perfect delivery. But there was something else there too. There was a man who had just taken a stand, who had just said no to injustice, who had just put his career and his reputation on the line for his principles. The audience gave him a warm welcome. They knew who he was. They had come to see him. They had paid good money to see one of the greatest entertainers in the world perform. During his performance that night, Dean did something that was somewhat unusual for him. He told a joke about the situation. He didn't name names or get too specific about what had happened, but those in the audience who knew what had transpired that evening understood what he was talking about. "You know," Dean said to the crowd, "I was thinking about something today. I was thinking about segregation. And I realized something very important. I realized that all of this segregation garbage is based on the idea that if we allow people of different races to mix freely, society will fall apart. That's what they tell us. That's what they've been telling us for years. But you know what I think? I think society is already falling apart. I think the thing that's holding it together is people choosing to be decent to each other, regardless of the color of their skin. And I think that's a message that needs to start coming from the top, from people in power, from people who have the ability to make a difference." The audience didn't quite know how to react. This was more serious than Dean's usual jokes. This was more political than he usually got. This was Dean making a statement that went beyond entertainment. Some people applauded, some people sat in uncomfortable silence, but the message was clear. Dean Martin had a conscience, and he was using his platform to speak out against injustice. He continued his performance with more songs and more jokes, but the tone had shifted. The audience knew that they were witnessing something more than just an entertainment performance. They were witnessing a man using his art to make a political and moral statement. After Dean's performance ended, around midnight, Sammy went on stage for his late-night show. The Copa room was still packed. Many people had stayed to watch Sammy perform. The performance was electric. Sammy knew what had happened. He understood what Dean had done for him, and his gratitude poured out onto that stage in every gesture, every note, every word. Sammy was a consummate professional. He was a performer of the highest order. He could sing beautifully. He could dance with incredible grace and precision. He could make people laugh. He could make people cry. He was a complete entertainer. And on this night, he poured all of his gratitude and all of his emotion into his performance. The audience was on their feet by the end of his set. They were applauding with genuine appreciation. They understood what had just happened. They understood that they had witnessed a moment of significance. When Sammy left the stage, he immediately went backstage to find Dean. They met in a private area, away from the cameras and the audience and the attention. "What you did tonight," Sammy said, and his eyes were glistening with tears. "You didn't have to do that. You put yourself at risk. You challenged the hotel, you challenged the system." "Yes, I did have to do it," Dean replied. His voice was quiet but firm. "I should have done it sooner. I should have done it a long time ago. This segregation garbage is morally wrong, Sammy. It's a violation of everything this country is supposed to stand for, and I'm not going to pretend that it's acceptable anymore. I'm not going to sit by quietly while my friend is treated like he's less than human." "It's going to cause you problems," Sammy warned. "There are people in this city who are not going to like what you did. There are people in this city who believe in segregation. There are people who are going to see what you did as a betrayal of your own race." "Then they're wrong," Dean said. "My race is the human race, Sammy. Your race is the human race. We all belong to the human race, and we're all supposed to treat each other with respect and dignity. Anyone who has a problem with that, anyone who believes that we should treat people differently based on the color of their skin, is wrong. And I don't care if they have a problem with me. I did what was right." Over the next few weeks and months, the story of what Dean had done spread throughout Hollywood and throughout the entertainment industry. People were talking about it. Some praised him, some criticized him, some said he was being naive. Some said he was being foolish for risking his career and his relationships with the hotel owners on a principle. But Dean didn't care about any of that. He had done what he believed was right, and that was enough for him. In the months and years that followed, Dean became increasingly vocal about civil rights. He spoke out against segregation. He refused to perform at venues that discriminated against black performers or audience members. He used his platform and his influence to push for change. He wasn't as famous for his civil rights activism as some other entertainers, like Harry Belafonte or Sidney Poitier, but his quiet, steady commitment to equality was powerful in its own way. Sammy Davis Jr. never forgot what Dean had done for him that night. The two men remained friends for the rest of their lives. They performed together frequently. They supported each other's careers. They stood together against racism and segregation. Their friendship became a symbol of what it meant to stand up for what was right, regardless of the consequences. Their friendship became a beacon of hope in a society that was struggling to overcome its own racism. Years later, when people would ask Dean about that night at the Sands, he would downplay it. He would say, "I just didn't think it was right for a man to be treated that way. I didn't think it was complicated. I thought it was simple. If someone's a good person and they're talented and they're a friend, you don't treat them like they're less than you. That should be obvious to everyone. It shouldn't take a special event or a special moment to make people understand that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect." But those who were there that night knew it was more than just a simple act of decency. It was a moment when a man with power and influence chose to use that power and influence to challenge an unjust system. It was a moment when someone said no to the way things had always been done and insisted on a better way. It was a moment that mattered.